Hello, everyone. My name is Opal Hope Bennett. I'm the shorts programmer for Doc NYC, and we want to thank you for joining us for the shorts program, New York Strong. New York is, of course, the home place of our festival, and this program is a annual one that we reprise every season to look at stories that highlight the special city that is New York and the special state. Because this program, this season, we have a non-New York City, but a New York State story that is also quite relevant for the times. So I'm really, really glad to have the directors and filmmakers from the grouping of films in this program here to join us. Let me introduce them to you. I was going to start with A Week in June by Jay Sansone, Road to Roxham by Cristian Gomes, Urban Growth by Nathan Kensinger and Nate Dorr, By Way of Canarsie by Emily Packer and Lesley Steele, and rounding out the program with The Grand Tour by Erin F. Babbin and Michael Sullivan. Hey guys. Good to see you all.
Hello.
So yeah, this was one of my favorite groupings of films this season for New York, mainly because we had a really great look at stories that looked at the city and its transformation. And then also we had a story that looked at the state as a bit of a gateway in the stories that were featured in that short. Please go through and share with us about your films. Let me start with Jay for A Week in June.
So my film, A Week in June, is a very brief look at the first week of the George Floyd protests in New York City. It's a very run and gun, on the street capture. Really, I'm getting attacked by a dog right now. It is, essentially it wasn't written. It wasn't, we just kind of went out with cameras. I went out alone during COVID. I didn't want to bring an assistant. I didn't want to bring crews. I saw it sort of happening outside my windows, and I grabbed my camera. And then what is in the film is about a week's worth of just finding 3 different activists, leaders, young youth that are that are part of the movement, and just approaching them and asking them, if they don't mind if I film, and then just staying with them as long as possible. The reason why I made the film, generally, it was just, being a white male, but of Puerto Rican heritage, of African American heritage. I have family members on both sides, and to me, I wanted to sort of try to bridge the gap in filmmaking. And a piece for my dad to watch, who only watches Fox News, who doesn't understand, and a piece for my friends who are out there marching for them to have their story told.
Let's go to Cristian, Road to Roxham.
Hello. Okay, so yeah, Road to Roxham is a story about refugee and asylum seekers using New York State as almost a new underground railroad to get to Canada, and specifically to an access point on the Canadian-US border that has sort of informally been called Roxham Road. So it's about asylum seeker stories, but it's also about the stories of the taxi drivers who help them get there, because of this informal economy has sprung up to service the people who are coming to Canada. It's a pretty close to the ground profile of those people. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristian. Urban Growth, Nathan.
Hey, I'm Nathan, and Nate and I have been collaborating for about 15 years on different projects about the New York City waterfront. And our film, Urban Growth, looks at a specific site in the Brooklyn Navy Yard called Admiral's Row. and traces out the history of Admiral's Row, really going back like 150 years in the piece, but more specifically looking at the recent evolution of it from being a collection of abandoned 19th century mansions that had turned into a wild growing forest, and which were then recently demolished to make way for a parking lot and a grocery store.
And the whole place was a great microcosm for themes we look at over and over again: the layers of the city, the way that development's happening everywhere along the waterfront, all the changes that are taking place, but being able to find those traces of the past there for a while sometimes.
Let's go to by way of Canarsie, Emily and Lesley.
Yeah, so our film takes a look at Canarsie, Brooklyn, which is a coastal neighborhood all the way at the other end of the L train. And it was a place that neither Lesley nor I had ever really been before we started filming. Lesley's a New York City native and I'm a transplant. We wanted to look at transportation, and that sort of took us in this other direction of looking at the community as a coastal community and how that has been impacted by the water, both in transportation and in all these other ways: recreation, resiliency in the face of climate change and Superstorm Sandy. And so we were really looking at how to paint a portrait of specifically the pier at Canarsie, where there may or may not be a ferry in the future.
And we were really excited to actually take time to get to know the community. And, you know, our filming every day and every weekend there was just such a phenomenal experience to highlight the faces and stories and voices that are often unheard in communities that are underserved essentially by resources in a city that's New York. So it was really an honor to be able to capture moments of their perseverance during this time, or during the time of wondering if the L train was going to be shut down. So.
And then we'll go to Grand Tour, Erin and Michael.
The Grand Tour is a short documentary about Barry, who lost his son Josh in the September 11th attacks. And so he gives a tour of the National September 11th Memorial. It's personal, and also talks about the history of the buildings and the history of the attacks and his son's life and last day. And what I really love about this film is that a lot of times when we think about September 11th, we immediately go to politics or conspiracy theories or whatever it is that's like not about the people. And this film really brings us back to the people.
Yeah, I think another aspect of it that's interesting too is that Barry sort of represents this group of people that has firsthand knowledge through his son being there and passing. And these people are kind of disappearing, you know. A lot of them are either getting older or, you know, moving away, or just aren't being, you know, listened to in terms of their, you know, retelling their stories. So it's nice to hear, you know, that segment be represented.
Yeah, that really struck me about your film. I remember when myself and the other associate programmers who program shorts were discussing it, we noted how it felt like you got to actually attend the tour through watching the film, and it was a really, I think, unique experience for folks who may not have been able to be there, to do it with an individual who has that personal connection. I wanted to talk about the films that really feature New York as like another subject, and I thought that was certainly the case for Urban Growth, as well as By Way of Canarsie. Can you guys speak about how when you were, you know, crafting the film, you really engaged with the city of New York as a part of the character of your subject?
Should I start? When we were making By Way of Canarsie, you know, being a native New Yorker, there's just, you know, there's a smell in the air, there's an ambience, and, you know, the way the leaves, you know, fly. There's just so many nuances and environment that was really important for us to capture, and, you know, regarding even transit. And so Emily and I were really fascinated with, you know, once we got off the train, for example, on the stop, you could smell the sea, you know, and you could hear the seagulls. And so it was this kind of entrancing, you know, kind of step into a world that is actually an urban environment, and it's New York City. And that is just so visceral that we just wanted you to feel kind of that energy, and not even energy, but I guess we wanted, you know, the audience to feel what it feels like to be here in New York, and to visually experience that, and sonically. So, you know, New York is my home, and I just had to honor, you know, this place through this story, given the context of mobility and access. So it was really an experience to capture that.
And I would just add, I think one of the things that we were interested in is sort of the like visceral and spiritual qualities of being near the water in New York City. It's different than water in other places. I think that Nathan and Nate can probably speak to that as well, but there's something that connects us to nature, although we're sort of like embedded in this urban center. And one of the things that we found when we were researching and when we were experiencing filming with the ferry is who has access to this like visual iconography of New York? Like, how do we experience it as people who live here? Is it through that sort of natural world, or how do we get to sort of experience that star power city skyline? And is that New York? Who gets to see it? Who gets to have it?
Yeah, going with what Emily just said, I think the natural landscape of New York is really fascinating, especially when you get these spontaneous natural landscapes that spring up in the cycles of building and development and economic changes. Certain areas get overlooked, like this one, where the houses were closed in the 70s and the forest grew up around them, and we had this amazing natural landscape. Totally, you could step into a forest and be out of view of the rest of the city. Didn't feel like you were in the city anymore at all, yet it's one of many of these kinds of locations which have appeared in the city over the years. So New York's always providing new protagonists, new facets of itself in its landscapes.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that and say a lot of the work that Nate and I do is rooted in urban exploration, which is visiting places that are off limits to other New Yorkers, and trying then to tell their stories and share them with a wider audience. And this is one of those places that was just fascinating. Admiral's Row was just an amazing place to visit, and we visited over the course of about 12 years. I think we were filming this piece, watching it as it evolved and slowly became more and more overgrown, and then unfortunately watching as it was demolished. And we intended the piece to be sort of a memorial to this space that so many New Yorkers never had a chance to see.
That is precisely the feeling that I was left with, because you have this feeling of discovery as you're watching the film, and then, you know, just as you're getting to know it, it expires as right in front of you. So yeah, that was definitely well captured. So in Road to Roxham and A Week in June, the stories that you've captured are very much springing out of a particular circumstance that's coming out of a particular point in time. And I'd love for you guys to speak to, well, some of the strengths and then some of the challenges, I think, around capturing stories like this where time is of the essence. But, you know, you're also in many ways providing a supplement to the news, right? You're able to give this really personal, dig down in a personal level for stories that, you know, we're all seeing in the news, probably more from a pastiche perspective. Let's start with you, Cristian.
Yeah, so Road to Roxham was really kind of a product of hearing tons of news, tons of rhetoric. about asylum seekers in the US, but specifically in this instance, crossing from the US into Canada. And I think what was lost in a lot of that and in news a lot of the time is just a really human perspective. And so that's, that's what motivated me to go there in the first place. And then I think once I got there, I realized, like you were saying, how timely this story was, because there were tons of people using New York State as a transit hub to get to Canada, but they were almost forgotten. No one was really in the US writing news about it. You really couldn't find any advocacy groups talking about it. And so I felt that right there at that point, even though this transportation system, spans all the way back to wherever asylum seekers or refugees are coming from, their host countries, back to New York City itself, that this point of transition was the right place to tell the story. And as you'll find out in the doc when you watch it, the crossing point actually closed down due to COVID-19. So it was especially timely because in Canada, we don't know if it will ever open up again. So we're kind of waiting to hear what happens there.
And Jay?
Yeah, to piggyback off of what some Christian sentiment, it's really about empathy and the humanity. And I think that's something that most of us can agree with as documentary filmmakers. So for me, it was the issue that I was tackling, such a powder keg issue. It's either you're on one side or the other, and you feel really strongly about it. There's really not that many people in the middle. So I tossed and turned with the idea of not releasing it, just holding it and waiting for festivals or something like that. But every time I thought about that, it just felt wrong. Like what I was making, I was making it for a reason. And the reason was for empathy. It was to show people what's really going on the street. So I decided to let's just get it out as soon as possible. So I went with, social media and just had people share it like it was like a piece of news. And I think it was successful in that where a lot of people that I would assume were on the right side of this issue watched it and sort of commented and sent me a message. And that to me was like, that's the success of it. I hope anyways, that I'm reaching people that would otherwise be angry, something like that. So to me, it was immediacy. It was important.
Yeah.
And just to add on, oh, sorry.
No,
I just wanted to add on that, it was a very conscious decision, I think, in Road to Roxham to stick with Marianne as the protagonist. You'll see when you watch it that all the stories of the asylum seekers and refugees are very compelling, and you want to stay with them, you want to hear more. But at the same time, I was conscious throughout making the film that even having a film that was about asylum seekers and refugees would turn off a huge audience immediately just because of preconceptions and prejudice. So I wanted to make sure that there was a relatable character that, I guess you could say both sides would be willing to watch and explore the issue through. So I hope it came out that way.
It's a really good point. In editing, it's like, you're like, okay, at what point are the right going to turn off? At what point are the left going to turn off? It's like, you don't, right. Yeah, right. It's a tough battle. I hope that people watch all the way through, but I totally agree with that sentiment. It's hard.
Well, I mean, that I think is why we want artists to lend their touch to this kind of storytelling, right? Because you're not in the journalistic posture of needing to, provide each side equally. You can really be coming at it from a posture of trying to build an empathy machine, right? To your point, Jay, around that, and remind folks as they're looking at someone else's story of the human connectivity between us all. So I think you both did a great job there. Let me turn to you, Erin and Michael. So the Grand Tour is as much a an interrogation of a father's response to grief, as it is I like that it's a bit of an aged look, for lack of a better phrase, of a 9/11 story. You know, like, I think, you know, the phrase is, of course, never forget, and of course nobody ever will, certainly no New Yorker will. But I think a lot of the storytelling often focuses on that day and the immediate aftermath. And what was compelling to the programming team with the Grand Tour was, you know, how this is looking at right now, how individuals are, you know, still grappling with the aftermath of it, specifically through the journey that that Barry has as a tourist, or excuse me, as a tour giver for the monument. So I'm curious, how did you guys get connected to him? And then what was important to you that viewers take away from this experience? Because you could have done it in different ways, and I thought the choices that you made were really interesting.
The producer of the film is actually a dear friend of mine. We're on a board together, and so her brother had passed on September 11th, and she was like, you know, my father's doing these tours and he's getting older, and we really want to have like a record of this. So that's like where the seed sort of started. And I think that, I mean, documentary filmmaking, going back to empathy, when I think of the choices that we made, both like filming and editing, we didn't ask him too much about sort of his political beliefs, of what he thought happened afterwards, or, you know, it was really just about the human connection and like honoring this massive loss that I think like our country, we all hold so many stories about, and it's like sometimes nice to get out of our heads and into our hearts about it, you know, about like connecting with others in that way.
Yeah, I think a lot of editing choices too had to do with his personality. He's a doctor and pretty straightforward in the way that he talks about things. He's, you know, he doesn't give this like super emotionally charged tour. It's kind of matter of fact in a lot of ways, but it's still really
and informative. I feel like he was, yeah, teaching folks along the way.
Yeah, I think I mean, if he wasn't primarily a doctor in his profession, he's retired now, I think he would have been just like a good history teacher or something. Like, but yeah, he's very straightforward, but yet, you know, people were still really touched during the tour, and we tried to catch a little bit of that. But, you know, one of the first things he talked to us about, which we see in his house, is talking about like dealing with PTSD and stuff like that. And so it's like the emotion is there, and, you know, his grief is visible, but, you know, we wanted to also be true to the way that he shares his story, and not to like say overly dramatize it, or to like focus too much on that, you know. Which is also, I think there's so much of that history included. Is it, you know, it was kind of a hard editing choice. How much time can you give to the history? But it just felt like this is really what it's about, and I think people are generally interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you guys, I guess you had limited time with him. I remember when we got to the tour and it's a rainy day, I thought they can't have chosen to have that happen. What was the story behind that?
We definitely had limited time. We're actually based in Chicago. So we flew down to DC, and this was, you know, he only was doing a tour a month at that time. And
right.
We took the train at about 4 a.m. with him from DC to New York. And so we did have like just one day of filming, and it happened to be pouring rain. And there were a lot of sort of challenges with that, and with being in the center of all these radio waves and the audio, you know, it was a challenging shoot. But I think that actually the rain adds to the sort of subtle emotional plane of the film.
Yeah, rain has a way of doing that, doesn't it? Well, I would love for each of you to please go through. We don't have audience to talk to us since we are pre-recording this, but please, each of you go through and share what you hope the audience takes away after having your film. Let's start with you, Erin and Michael.
Yeah, I think that it would be great if, you know, the audience can think about the fact that like all these family members are still out there affected, and that, you know, they say like never forget and all of that, but it's not just like the numbers. It's not just that, you know, almost 3,000 people died, but it's like thinking about that there's stories behind each of those people. And then one of the things that Barry says in his tour is, you know, that not all of the remains of those people were recovered. And so when you're down there at the memorial, if you get to visit, to remember that it's, you know, it's also essentially like a burial site as well as, you know, a remembering site. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. And for me, I just really take away about like honoring our oral histories and keeping records of the people.
Let's go to Emily and Lesley.
Well, I think there's a lot that can be taken away in a series of vignettes. We're left with an overall feeling, but one thing that really sticks with me is part of the interview that we included with Chief Curtis Sinigha of the Lenape tribe. And he says civilizations, I'm paraphrasing, civilizations like this have fallen into the water before, and there's no reason that it can't happen again. And I think looking at all of these like incredibly passionate, hardworking people in Canarsie who care about their community and care about each other and have very different ideas about how to do that actively, I think it's just important to start reckoning with this like larger problem that we're facing as a city and as these little enclaves, just to like think for a second about how complicated it's going to be to get everyone's needs addressed as we're in this new phase of climate change.
And one additional thing that I would love for the audience to consider is, you know, essentially going to Canarsie is a journey, and there's a stillness that's there, you know, and a calmness that's there, and especially on the water. And so when you're watching, I hope that you can just experience that journey in your own stillness, and actually see this place that you probably haven't seen before.
Jay?
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about this one before, but I just think that it's the thing to take away is that everyone is human. While the news shows looting and burning and rioting, these are human beings. These are people with backstories and pain and yes, anger, but in many cases the anger is just. And I would just hope that we take some of the empathy that you may find in my film and that you're getting from my film and use it, apply it to perhaps the news or any other scenario where you're watching this particular subject.
Thank you. Cristian?
I think what I want people to take away from Road to Roxham is a realization that news, rhetoric, and policy go far deeper than some may think. It's a fact that most, you know, asylum seekers and refugees who are escaping to Canada right now from the US don't feel safe in America anymore. And there's a reason for that. And I think it takes a lot of reflection on both sides and a lot of thinking about how, you know, the US and Canada can shape policy to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore.
Thank you. And we'll wrap it up with Nathan and Nate.
Yeah, I mean, our piece is definitely meant to transport people to this mysterious location and have them kind of experience it for themselves. But it's also meant to ask questions about a lot of different issues that New York City is facing and that other cities are facing. So, you know, it looks at issues around ecological concerns. It looks at historic preservation questions. It looks at like the question of like, what is capitalism causing by destroying green spaces to replace them with parking lots? So there's a lot to unpack there, which I think is fascinating, hearing the other filmmakers too. New York City is just kind of a microcosm of so many different issues that all of these films explore. So it's great to hear from the other filmmakers too.
Yeah, I guess I just want people to, when watching our film, consider what the best outcomes are for various parts of the city that are in transition, or what they would like to see from them, and to know that those things are always changing and not set in stone and can be reshaped. And also just to look at their own environments and observe what the places they might pass over in their own environments while those are still there.
All really important and rich and resonant messages, as you would expect, since they're talking about this grand city. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you for your work. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to feature it in the festival this season. And to our audience, thank you for checking out the Shorts programming. There are several more programs. If this is the first that you're seeing, please check out some more. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.